Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand. Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny.
Hello, and welcome to the History of the Atlantic World podcast, a proud member of Big Heads Media Network. I'm Jesse Weeks. What follows is my conversation with Dr. Robert Murray, a history professor at Mercy College and the author of Atlantic Passages, Race, Mobility, and Liberian Colonization. There's a link in the show notes where you can buy this book, and as an extra bonus, for the rest of this month, that's February of 2021, you can use the special promo code BHM21 for a huge discount on the price of the book, as well as free shipping. Now, before we dive into that discussion, I also really need to tell you about another great show from Big Heads. That's Dear World Love History. It's absolutely brilliant. It's produced by the outlandish historians, Adrian and Renee. And it's the other link in the show notes. They've recently actually completed a series on the golden age of the pirates, which is really one of my favorite topics, and the series is just absolutely wonderful. So with that said, please check out the quick promo for that show, and then we'll get to the interview. Thanks.
Hey, we're Renee.
And Adrian.
And we are
The Outlandish Historians. We're sisters.
Nerds.
And lovers of all things history.
Except bell bottoms. Keep that in the past.
Come hang out with us on the Dear World of History podcast, where we'll frolic through time
as we chat and geek out over the good, the bad, and the downright ugly history of the world.
We promise you don't have to be a licensed historian to travel through time with us.
Maritime disasters?
Check.
Historical serial killers?
Check.
Glamorous and petty royals?
Check and check. You can find us almost anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
Follow us on Twitter at Dear Historians and Instagram at Outlandish Historians.
So chug that drink me bottle and come on down the rabbit hole. It's going to be a wild ride.
We should be ready to go. Okay. Dr. Murray, Robert, if I may, thank you for joining us. I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed your book. And if you don't mind, before we start talking about it, I just want to start the conversation with a quote from a 19th century newspaper advertisement that is in your book for a runaway. Quote, 2-cent reward. Keep a good lookout. Ran away from the subscriber on the night of the 14th, Isaiah Hollister, an indentured apprentice of a brown complexion, aged about 15 years. Any person apprehending him and delivering him to me in Monrovia shall receive a reward of 2 cents if found out of this county, and if in the county 1 cent, but no further expenses whatever in either case. All persons are forewarned from harboring him. D.B. Brown, unquote. I don't think there's anybody listening to this that would find the content of such an advertisement shocking. But when I was reading your book, it brought me back to a day when I was a naive undergraduate history student taking a survey class on African history. I think it was from 600 to 1900 AD. But anyway, during one lecture in the class, I was shocked, and I mean shocked, to learn about technically two countries, because this was we're doing over 1,000 years of history here in one survey course, but Sierra Leone and the country of your book, the African Republic of Liberia. The topic of your book, and for anyone who isn't aware, basically Liberia is a colonial project of some people in the United States, with the goal of giving African Americans a better life of what they had by transplanting them back to Africa. On July 26th in 1847, the colony of Liberia declared independence from the United States and became the Republic of Liberia, the first quote unquote modern Western style republic in Africa. And I should say, again, the name of the book is Atlantic Passages, Race, Mobility, and Liberian Colonization. Dr. Robert Murray. Robert, thank you for joining us again. Okay, so for anybody listening who was like me, naively not knowing anything about Liberia, which could you just please elaborate just a little bit on what I said about the founding of Liberia, maybe particular what the American Colonization Society was?
Sure. First off, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, of course.
The
I
African
kind of rushed
survey
right
was
through that. Sorry.
was from 600 to what were the dates?
I want to say it was from 600 to 1900. It was like basically everything but ancient Egypt. It was.
Yes. Well, and I have the similar experiences in many ways. My own training is I never claim African history because of these. So often it's taught as this massive survey,
right?
In American history. So my own training is much more in African American studies, African American history.
Yes.
And so so in many ways, this is also me stumbling upon this African republic as well. And so the roots, the American Colonization Society, that's a bit of a misnomer, if only because we should remember the first title, the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color of the United States, which is a real mouthful.
Right. Yes.
It's why we just shortened that to the American Colonization Society, or ACS. And the line the word to underline is free people.
Right.
And so this is a society formed by very prominent, very elite whites in Washington, D.C. Variably, you'll see some sites list its founding as 1816, some say 1817. They did this wonderful thing where they had an early meeting in December of 1816 and then said, oh, let's come back in January of 1817. And that's when they formally met. It's leading ministers, evangelicals, politicians, the white elites in Washington, D.C. And they're united by this belief that free people of color are a problem, and that needs to be rectified. And they're going to lay claim to one Black thinker in particular, an Afro-Indian sea captain named Paul Cuffey, who argued that establishing settlements of African Americans, free African Americans along the coast of Africa would disrupt the remnants of the Atlantic slave trade. It would spawn what has been called the legitimate commerce argument, right? That by establishing these trading outposts along the coast of Africa, you will change the economy of Africa, subvert the Atlantic slave trade, and as an added bonus, you would Christianize. This would be the pathway to spreading Christianity through Africa. And so very, very early on, you can already kind of see there's a sort of inherent problem with the ACS is, well, one, for us, it's a white supremacist organization. It is quite literally dedicated to the whitening of the United States. This is right. Very literally want to create a white republic in the United States. But two, it's a huge tent. So you get evangelical, Christian ministers find this idea appealing for the evangelical possibilities. The anti-slave trade folks find this intriguing. Anti-slavery activists, although the title and the goal of the organization is free people of color, they're intrigued by the idea that maybe the lessons of this is how to end slavery in the United States. The thinking being that one of the main reasons that folks support slavery is it provides that control mechanism, and the fear is a free Black population in the United States, and this removes quite literally that problem. And then, of course, but then there are also pro-slavery people within the same organization as well, who see this as not a path to anti-slavery, because again, the point of the organization is the removal of free people of color.
Right.
And so it's this big tent organization for whites. and that leads to all it's confusing. It moves in many different directions. Its organization is fairly interesting in terms of the structure. So it has a president, often, for years it's Henry Clay in the antebellum period, which kind of strikes at the political power of its membership, at least, if not the group itself. It's filled with congressmen and senators and really prominent folks. Many of them are given titles for vice presidents, which are just sort of honorifics. It's designed to drum up support for the organization. But the actual the day-to-day sort of operations falls to this group of managers and sort of bureaucrats, for lack of a better phrase, that run the sort of day-to-day operations. And they organized expeditions. So they organized the actual funding of ships, putting people on boats, the colonial apparatus. And the funding comes from these state societies. So each state has its own auxiliary society. And then each state society is itself made up of many, many like local auxiliary societies. So all of these things are gathering money from churches, benefactors. The July 4th sermon is one of the big fundraising methods of the group, right? This appeals to ministers Christianizing Africa. And so the money kind of flows up through this sort of very sort of complex, it's almost like a pyramid scheme, right? The money flows up to the organization. And so like your little local group may be attracted to colonization for one reason, and the group next down the street might like it for a completely different reason. And so they have these sort of cantankerous, contentious history, because it's this big tent organization, again, of white people, at least.
Right. Yeah, no, that's one thing that I really find that there were so many different motivations that people would have for getting into that. And now, okay, one thing that I found I definitely want to talk about because we're talking about the 19th century here, colonization in the 19th century, and it seems very, very similar to in some ways, the colonization. I mean, obviously, in some ways, it's very different, but the colonization of the Americas, I guess, especially for the way life was very difficult for the people going to Liberia. Would you like to talk about what would happen to these people? They're just dropped off on Africa, and especially in the early years when this first starts, what is happening?
Sure. Yeah. So there are some interesting parallels to your point, that one of the oddities of the American Colonization Society is it's a private benevolent society, and so hopefully it's not too out of line to immediately correct the host.
No, excuse me, please. No, yeah. Correct me all the time.
So one of the oddities, when Liberia declares independence in 1847, it doesn't declare independence from the United States, because it's not a colony of the United States.
Okay.
It declares independence
from the private enterprise. Correct. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
No,
I think I pretty much just summarized that from Wikipedia too. So now I want to look at that and make sure that they're not wrong too.
I wouldn't doubt that they're.
So I'm sure. No, but that's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, no, it's this horribly complex situation, but it's also this well-connected society. And so what you end up with is this entanglement. The U.S. Navy frequently, swings by and provides support. Under President Monroe, when the United States abolishes the Atlantic slave trade, as part of that legislation, they decide that they need a receiving place. So if the United States Navy intercepts any illegal ships engaged in the Atlantic slave trade, they don't take them back to where the ship originated. They just this conflation of all Africa is the same. They just go to Liberia. Yeah. And so there are federal agents. There's a federal role for Liberia. So it's this federal joint private organization that creates all sorts of complications. And so the inaugural expedition to create this new colony in 1820, the Elizabeth, that leaves from New York, they think they're heading to Sherbro Island off the coast of Sierra Leone due to some previous connections. Paul Cuffey had met an individual who operated off that island, and so they think that's where they're going, and they get there and there's no fresh water. So one of the important things about a colony is
you're gonna need some water.
you're gonna need some water. And so they end up stranded in Sierra Leone, which is, as you said, the British equivalent to this colony. Yeah. They're kind of adrift, trying to figure out how to negotiate land. And so it's these private agents with these federal agents that are sort of along, and then none of them actually have instructions about who has power and authority to do what. The settlers that are along with them think that they're creating their own, independent society. The federal agents believe they're essentially contractors for the federal government to build a federal outpost. The benevolent society agents think that they're there as part of it. And so it's just glorious confusion, and really strikes at the muddledness of this. And the way they secure the first treaty for the future site of Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, the first settlement, the first American settlement, is basically the Lieutenant Stockton of the USS Alligator is just a U.S. naval vessel is there patrolling and just offers his services. He's a supporter of the colonization movement. And so this relatively weak, but it's not a nation state. It's a private organization. They suddenly have the authority of this U.S. military ship sailing behind them, and that provides the military might and the threat of military force from the United States to secure this treaty from these indigenous African peoples around Monrovia, or the future site of Monrovia, I should say. And so there's all sorts of conflict and confusion and muddleness that really has these sort of parallels, to other spaces in the Atlantic world. And especially the use of military. So the dark irony or comedy of this is you have, in many ways, the might of the U.S. Navy is what secures is the stick that secures the treaty from these indigenous African leaders, who are not necessarily thrilled with the idea of signing this treaty.
Right.
And then the U.S. Yeah, and then the US Navy
I wanted
sails
to
away.
get it. I mean, that kind of gets into one of my next questions is, from the perspective of these people who are living in it. This there isn't just a spot in Africa for the society to just set up a city and a colony and all these plantations and everything that they get going. How do the local, I don't know if tribes is the right word, but the local African groups, how does some of these, what is their feeling on this?
Right. No, it's a great question. So one of the peculiarities, because it's not terribly odd, but one of the defining characteristics of Liberia, even today, it's remarkably diverse. There's many different groups there. Now, a lot of them today use the tribe language of tribe,
right?
But that's actually coming in through the American,
the
American English arriving in Africa. But they're sort of stateless societies. They're frequently they're individual villages or towns with a leadership. They, through genealogy, shared ancestry, allegiance or alliances with other towns or villages across the coast, but they don't land amongst a cohesive confederacy. They don't land amongst a cohesive group, a single African nation.
Right.
And so that one of the mechanisms they're able to succeed despite being relatively weak, right? They don't have the full-on force of a nation state. They have the coincidence of when a U.S. naval vessel is in their area, they can call upon it for aid, but it's not a sustained military presence. but because they arrive in this sort of disjointed collection of peoples, or at least they're not, I shouldn't say they're disjointed, they're
Right. Yeah, and I think a phrase I just read recently, politically fractured, I guess,
right,
maybe too. Yeah.
yeah, their understandings of how their society works. So even though they're Bassa or Glebo or Vai, their alliances work differently. And so and they all have their own pre-existing historical rivalries, and this town has a long feud with this other town because of access to trade and things like that. And so as the society arrives and starts depositing settlers, they negotiate sort of individual treaties, frequently under threat, violence, and force. But they find themselves, it's this kind of constellation. They frequently find themselves with indigenous African allies in these conflicts, much with parallels to North America,
right,
or the Americas broadly.
Yeah.
And so they're trading partners, sometimes enemies, sometimes friends, sometimes allies of convenience. And it's this really kind of complex matrix of expansion. Add to this, you get those recaptured Africans, those Africans captured in the illegal slave trade that are frequently they're thousands of miles away, and they're deposited in Liberia. They get the nickname the Congos. It's sort of a generic association that they come from the Congo region of Africa. And so if you're Congo in Liberia, yes, you're on African soil, but you're thousands of miles away from home.
Right.
What do you do? And so they become very much allied with many of the settlers as well, because it's the way to go. They have their own settlement, New Georgia.
Right.
So
yeah, that's one of the neat things I think about Liberia. I mean, just from, I guess from the history of I recently watched this is kind of just getting us off on a tangent, but I think I recently saw or watched a YouTube video, just one of those YouTube videos, and it was like asking a British person, what do you guys learn about the American Revolution? And it's just this is so much of this is African history. This is also kind of American history. And I just want to point out to anybody listening who has ever asked the question of themselves, what do they learn in Britain about the American Revolution if you live here in the United States? Well, I think I should ask you, what do you know about Liberia? Anyway.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's a great point. I mean, as somebody, like I said, I have that kind of, I'm always amazed. I had colleagues or know people today, they entered graduate school and they knew I'm doing the history of this explicit thing in this time in this place from these years. And they knew that from day one. And I very much drifted into this. And so I share that sort of, even as the person that wrote the book on this, I'm the authority. I'm putting this in air quotes for your listeners, but I share this wonderment of like, I was learning about this as I was writing my dissertation.
Right. Well, and one of the most fascinating things I learned specifically about this in your book is that, and me speaking about how this is American history, is that as Liberian society develops, you get some very similar societal divisions in Liberia that exist in America. And one in particular I just want to talk about, I guess, is that sometimes the Americo-Liberians, I guess, is the term. The Americo-Liberians, some of them from the north who had greater resources than some of the Americo-Liberians who were from the south, didn't always get along. And would you like to talk about that I guess that tension?
Sure. No, because to your point, although I study this spot in Africa, I very much I see this. I'm very much conceive of myself as an American historian, because one of the things that I'm really trying to do in the book is sort of bring this into, right, this is an American establishment. They have a Georgia, they have a Maryland, they have a Virginia. You know, their structure of Liberia today is based upon counties.
Right.
So
yeah, and that's why I wanted to read that advertisement for the Runaway, is because, and I don't think I fully clarified this now that I'm looking back at it, but I would not be surprised, and I guess I don't think there'd be too many people listening who would be surprised if that referred to somewhere in Mississippi or Louisiana. Right. I'm sure there is a Monrovia County somewhere out in the deep South, but you know, and then to discover there's this surprising American-like advertisement. Anyway.
Yeah, and so to kind of get at so you've got divisions and conflict with the sort of indigenous African peoples, plural, there. And then you have internal conflict as well. And I think to strike at the internal conflict is to note that, at least amongst African Americans, right, within the population of free blacks in the United States, colonization is not popular. It is not. So it's a big tent for white people. Right. It is not for African Americans. And for all, so I mean, right, you see this at David Walker's appeal. And there's all, he has one of his sections is entirely about the colonization movement, the colored convention movement, the sort of beginning of sort of nationwide political organizations within free people of color that also launched state and local convention movement. The convention movement launches initially as an immigration movement. They're looking for space to go somewhere else, to abandon ship, so to speak, in the United States.
Right.
But they explicitly take Liberia off the table because it's this product of ACS. Martin Delaney, another great thinker in the Black Atlantic for immigration with an E.
Yeah.
You know, Liberia is off the table because they see it as a pawn of the it's not a black-led organization or a black-led society. It's this white, they're puppets of this white group. And so you know, being removed far from home, unappealing. The Colonization Society seems structured to remove slavery's most ardent opponents. You know, remove them away to preserve slavery in the United States. There's a laundry list of things in which this is not appealing for African Americans. And so it's widely panned and dismissed and challenged, and it's actually one of the most important reasons that you get the adoption of a again, air quotes for your listeners, colored or Negro identities. So, you know, if you think about like Black religious institutions, you have the African Methodist Episcopal Church. African was a moniker used in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But what makes this really just odd and complex is the Colonization Society, while also being a white supremacist organization, also ties into Pan-Africanism, because it argues that this is a homecoming for these people, that blackness is the shared identity on either side of the Atlantic, and that it celebrates, you know, these people who are the dregs of the society here, that are holding us back, that are, you know, threats of racial violence, in their natural, air quotes for your listeners, their natural native home, they will thrive. Right. And so it leads to this shift with it. Suddenly African Americans go, well, we can't use this, we can't keep calling our organizations African, because it's part of we're going to be shipped away to this distant land. And so I bring that up because I read when I was learning this history myself, and so that's the broad narrative, and it's accurate. What surprised me are the sort of individuals, the John Brown Russworms of the world, right, who do go. And John Brown Russworm, he's really fascinating character. He's one of the first African American college graduates in the United States. He goes to Bowdoin. He grows up in Maine, like the whitest, I think maybe still the whitest state today. He's the child of an enslaved woman, and he's born in Jamaica, a Jamaica planter who relocates to Maine. He marries again. His white stepmother, says that she's going to raise John Brown in her family. And so he's raised in this environment. He goes to college. He joins the same literary society as Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yeah.
And he's co-editor of the Freedom's Journal, first black newspaper in the United States. And initially he's anti-colonization. He's part of this anti-colonization rhetoric and thinking. And slowly, by the 1830s, he evolves his position, and he becomes just so frustrated and tired of the United States. He just says, "I'm off," and he relocates first to become a newspaper editor. He's eventually going to be the first.
I apologize
black
if you can hear the dog drinking water right now. I'm sorry. I didn't really think about when I set up I don't know if you guys can hear that. But sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I was like, I have to say something if people can hear this. I'm not going to edit it out, is what I'm saying. He's a big old. He's actually my roommate, and he's a mastiff mix with. He's like huge, so he's like drinks like. If you just so you can see him, here he is right here, and he just when he is thirsty, he's you can hear
that is a big dog.
Yeah, he is a big dog. Yeah, he's a sweetheart, but he could be a little noisy. Sorry, buddy. I'm talking about you. All right. Okay. I apologize for cutting you off. No. I don't know if you remember where you were.
Russ, so what struck me is that they're small. There are individuals that find Liberia an appealing option, and so I began sort of thinking, like, okay, what is it that strikes these people? They're the Roberts, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, the first president of the Republic, or the McGills, who you wanted to chat about, who are right. I could talk about the McGill family forever. There were,
and for anybody listening, there were so many people that that you bring up in the book and that I learned about that are so fascinating. I considered, and I was like, boy, he might not like it, and I don't know if anybody would like it but me, but I considered just making every question about a specific individual that you talk about in the book. But anyway, I also wanted to give the wider context a little bit.
No, but that's those stories are what drew me into this understanding that this is a much more complex place. Yeah. And so for most histories of Liberia, right, it's a fairly straightforward tale that these people are forced, they're formally enslaved, and one of the main mechanisms is that an enslaver will offer emancipation and relocation or continued enslavement. And so the narrative is that this is an overwhelmingly forced population. They are held there against their will. They are miserable and hate it, and this is a one-way journey. And once you start kind of reading this is a very much a settler-driven book. It really, once you start reading their letters, those people definitely do exist. But there's also this real complexity here about what is it that these people that chose to go there or found something different there, what is it that they were looking for? And that starts striking at the sort of inequalities of the United States that begin to be replicated in Liberia. And there's this sort of matrix. And one of the things that really struck me is that I think, and this is sort of, I think, you span Atlantic history. I mean, my God, you start this podcast with the War of Jenkins' Ear.
I like to. I love it all. I like to talk it all.
And I think one of the sort of I don't know if it's not everywhere, but one of the things about thinking about Atlantic history is because it's so vast, as it's so big, we're really good at finding that one movement, right? The settler society, the relocation, or maybe we can follow somebody who moves twice. But the sort of complexity and how mobile this society is really, it's really hard to strike at. And so I've read so many books where the Liberian settlers, they get on the boat in the United States, they get off the boat in Africa, and that's it. And when you start reading their letters, you start realizing, oh no, actually they're they're coming back to the States.
Right. Yeah.
They're
And in
this
some
is-
cases, just making multiple trips.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. That was
And-
very interesting.
And so one of the things that you start realizing is that these people that find something there, the small population that do, what they find is that they can renegotiate their relationship to the United States. And so you do, the McGills come back many times, and there's this matrix of reasons. Some are sponsored by the Colonization Society. So the Colonization Societies, because they're white driven, the more successful of the state organizations in Maryland in particular, really suddenly it just dawns on them, it's like, oh, testimonials. We should have settlers come back and speak about life in Liberia. And so they begin sponsoring folks that come back to basically travel. Education is a major one. We can talk about McGill later. Medical education. The McGill goes to Dartmouth. He's sponsored by the Maryland State Colonization Society to go to Dartmouth to actually get a medical degree. He graduates. He's the first African American to graduate from an American medical institution.
Right.
And he can do this at the exact same historical moment when other African Americans are being denied admission. James McCune Smith, the first Black African American graduate of a medical school, he has to go to Europe.
Yeah.
And he graduates just a couple of years before McGill. McGill and him are actually contemporaries. And the only reason that McGill can get into Dartmouth and get a medical degree is because he has this colonization sponsorship, these well-placed whites.
Right. Okay.
And so some are, so they're coming back sponsored by the colonization societies. Some of them find themselves in a position to come back and visit family that they left behind. Some are coming back to free family that they left behind enslaved. Some are just coming back for lack of, it's touristy almost. They want to go back, see family, see friends. They want to go revisit certain sites.
Right.
John Brown Russell goes back up to Maine. He complains about the prices of hotels in Boston. and so one of the things you realize is the sort of Pan-Africanism of the Colonization Society, by celebrating their life in the colonies and saying that if you relocate to Africa, you will be Christianizing benighted Africa. You'll be elevating the society. You'll be the civilizers, air quotes for your readers,
yeah.
the civilizers of this continent.
And I think one of the reasons I chose McGill, and it's also because that's one of the, you mentioned, and he's a doctor. One of the, I guess I remember in your book mentioning one of the arguments, I guess, against people like him who are just eager to go over to Liberia is, well, I guess the African American population here in the States, we would really like the doctor, to stay here.
Yeah.
I think I remember a TV show where I saw the doctor get kidnapped, in fact, for something like that. But anyway, one thing I specifically want to ask you about is, because you mentioned, a big part of Liberia's history, I guess, is before emancipation in the United States. Would it be possible for a Liberian colonist to visit an enslaved family member? How would that work? Would that be just something that would be very dangerous, potentially dangerous, I should say, or?
Yes,
yeah,
it's something that weighs on them. So one of the things that they're very skilled at doing is holding these colonization societies accountable. And so one of the things I want to get away from in the book is this idea of this sort of duped colonists. Like these settlers, because the colonization societies have a very tenuous actual hold on their colonies in Africa, the settlers really are engines that drive this movement. And one of the things that they do is hold the societies accountable. And so there's letters going back, and they're filled with questions. If I go back to the South, what will happen? Is it safe? What are the ports? And what you end up with, because it's all sorts of really odd things. So because these are individuals in a colony of a private benevolent society, they don't actually have any sort of national identity themselves. I use the term Americo-Liberian. It's sort of taking their later identity and projecting it back in history. I just had to do it as a shorthand because saying, settlers and their children.
Yeah.
At some time. But they all call themselves Americans, but they don't have any sort of they're sort of stateless in many ways.
Yeah.
And so McGill, to get, he arrives in Maryland and then he needs to go up to New Hampshire, and he lives in Vermont across the river. And so the Colonization Society prepares him with this sort of odd document saying of who he is, and it's like a passport. They get the local Baltimore judge who supports the colonization movement to sign off on it. But and so in this exact same moment, African Americans are denied passports, right? They're denied these travel documents. These colonization societies are sort of functioning as weird surrogate state departments for their own organizations. They're sponsoring these people. They're and for the Liberian settlers, they do not want to ride Jim Crow. They are not interested in segregated living, spaces or segregated travel accommodations. They left the United States because of that. They have you celebrate us in Africa. We are the tip of civilization's spear. So if we are now great, you must recognize us as such. And for many colonizations, it's this real awkward, oh, okay, yeah, so yes, I guess you can stay in my house. I guess, yeah, you shouldn't ride on that coach, on the roof. You shouldn't. And so, the Marylanders from McGill, when he's going north, they write to the owners of the ship that he's on and say he's a paying passenger. Please, treat him as a paying passenger, right? It's code for as a white person. And so they secure, like I said, the first African American graduate of a medical school. They secure all sorts of training, accommodations, travel, prestige. The Maryland Colonization Society that named Russwurm the governor, I should mention. Liberia is probably better said as called colonies initially. There are several these state organizations. A couple of them established their own separate settlements that are eventually going to be all merged together. And so the Marylanders established their own little separate colony. They creatively call it Maryland and Liberia. They spend a lot of time on that name. And so, they named Russwurm an African American. He's actually the first African American or Black governor of a colony. And so when he comes back to the States to visit, they throw a banquet in his honor. And so you have just to underscore how the paradoxes here, you have colonizationists who are actively trying to create a white republic. The profits of racial unrest, and that a free Black population in the United States will create social unrest and disharmony and race wars. That's what they preach, and they throw a banquet for a Black man. And the later the president of the Colonization Society he remembers the white Irish waiters being perturbed that they're supposed to serve this Africa,
right.
And so it's really it's really complex, and they really do in some ways a remarkable job. Now there's constraints to that, and this gets back to your question, which I'm bad about rambling, so apologies.
No, that's okay.
But this goes back to your question about the divisions within that society, for there, and it also ties to your quote about 2 cents reward. So you have this runaway indentured servant ad, but the offer isn't dollars, it's pennies. And that really reflects the sort of economic realities of these colonies. For many, there is a larger population of formerly enslaved people there. So they have issues of poverty, obviously, issues of finding, cash, how do we make money? What's the economic engine that drives this colony? So it's broadly a poor colony. And so sponsorship by the colonization societies, both in the bureaucracy And so many of the early governor positions were white, but like the assistant governor, the assistant agent is what they called it,
Yeah.
or the colonial council. These are all settler positions, and they all, if you're the storekeeper or the secretary, these all have salaries. And so you have already some natural prejudices that a Liberian settler who is literate, who is freeborn, they already come into the colony with previous advantages, and then they can secure those colonial positions, which gives them more advantages. Gender is a significant role because one of the main sponsorships for these transatlantic travels is speaking before audiences about their experiences in Africa, because the audiences are mixed sex, occasionally mixed race. The colonization societies want men to do it. And so you have, you mentioned one of the names, Charles Scotland. He's this fascinating character. He for most of the speakers that they employ, they're usually people of if not the governor, they're people that found success. They're usually colonial administrators. Scotland's pretty middling. He's not impoverished, but he's not their normal spokesman. But he's the sort of venerated, revered. He's sort of an older man. And so he's able to come back and do this American travel with colonization sponsorship because essentially he's a man. Right. And so you've got class issues, gender issues, freeborn versus formerly enslaved, and then obviously racial dynamics as well. Racially ambiguous folks like Russworm, like Roberts, like McGill, right. Because they have advantages due to white understandings of that racially ambiguous, the so-called mulatto class is elevated above the quote unquote pure African. And so it's many of these racially ambiguous folks are the ones that they sponsor or support, name to their positions of authority. And so there's some real there's colorism within this Liberian society, and class and status and gender all swirling together.
It's far too complicated for one day split between that and Sierra Leone in a class to go back to that. Yeah. Now I also want to mention too. I want to. I'm looking at my questions for I think I've mentioned this before in a previous interview. I tell everybody I write my questions down, and sometimes I don't necessarily ask them in order. But okay. I also just think this is really funny, so I want to ask about this. Some of the economic problems of the colony, or a lot of it, I think, has to do with the poor management and the confused nature. To get back to that, I just want to. You mentioned a line that I just thought was really funny. A merchant who is writing an addendum to a previous letter, quote, "I mentioned prunes to you. I am told they do not grow in the tropics," unquote. And just beyond the humor in that statement, I really suspect that a lot of the colonists themselves don't really appreciate that sort of probably mismanagement that to them isn't as funny as a joke about prunes. No. Do you want to talk about how does this economy, I guess, start? How does that get go? I mean, how does Liberia work, I guess?
Sure. Yeah. In some ways, the answer is barely. But the prunes comment is great. That's a Baltimore merchant who's they have. So one is the sort of armchair geographers and planters in the United States. So their vision, to go back to your earlier point, their vision of this, and they write off Liberia has an enormous mortality rate. It's the acclimating fever. You're introducing Americans to tropical diseases. The mortality rate is really high, and immediately the colonizationists, being the boosters, say, well, it's just like Jamestown. They really do envision Liberia becoming this United States in Africa. This is going to be the Niger River is going to have steamboats and be mistaken for the Mississippi River, and they're armed with this monthly journal, the African Repository, and they've got the maps, and they say and they're constantly sending coffee, prunes, which I don't know how profitable prunes would be, but they're just filled with these ideas about what this thing should be, steamships. And so, to your point, from the very beginning, from that very first expedition, the settlers are very determined to make this their own enterprise. Even those that it was sort of a choiceless choice to be on these expeditions to go to Liberia.
Yeah, because and I apologize to interrupt. I do recall you mentioning, at least, there was one planter, I guess, in Virginia who just, in his will, just said, okay, my 200 slaves are all going to Liberia. Goodbye.
Yep.
Or something like that, yeah.
And so so you have these folks that this was the choiceless choice is the term that really applies here, that it's a history of slavery or continued slavery, or a chance to die of acclimating fever. And so it's really complicated in that the settlers really want to take ownership of this society. And one of the things that is really problematic in terms of the governance is that the colonization societies initially on, they send white agents to be in charge. And so this is Jehudi Ashman, it's an Ezekiel Skinner, a number of white agents. They think that this is like a training idea. The governor, the agent, is going to be white, and he's going to oversee, and it's going to be sort of an early white man's burden idea. And the settlers are not at all interested in that arrangement. And so what you find very early on, there's such discord in the colony, they have to send their longtime secretary, a guy named Ralph Gurley, who basically is the American Colonization Society. He edits the journal. He is their secretary. He runs the correspondence. He is the white colonization. He is the figure, the most prominent white colonizationist in terms of running the organization. And he has to get on a boat, go to Liberia and look around. He creates this report, and he says, our what we think is going to work, it's just not. And so he's the one that says, we just need to create a settler council. The vice agent is going to be a settler, and they really this. We can either recognize what they are creating, or we can just pretend like this isn't the reality on the ground. And so what ends up happening is the sort of colonial bureaucracy, the colonial council, the judges, the assistant agent, the lieutenant governor, for lack of a better phrase, are all settlers. And because the mortality rate's so high, because so many of the white governors get sick, or because they just give up and they go home, and it's months long journey, and then you have to appoint somebody new, and it's months back, you end up that although I say Russwurm is the first officially appointed, black governor of these colonies. There are black governors they're vice agents. They're functioning as governors in absence of an officially appointed governor. And so the settlers are the ones that really drive this colonial enterprise. They're not just, the dupes, the puppets of these white authority figures. They really are the ones expanding this state. And so their vision of what this is very different from the whites back home. Early on, what drives it is basically it becomes Liberia's settlements. They're overwhelmingly coastal. And so they have this idea of farming, but they have all sorts of issues farming. And of course, now we know, the coastal soils of Liberia, they lack nutrients. They suffer from erosion. There's all sorts of settler letters explaining, the first crop of potatoes does great, and then after that, it's a famine. And so they have this vision of, right, if you think about, many of these people are formerly enslaved peoples, like they're farmers. That's what they,
Right.
they see, they want a farm. That's what
Yeah.
they want, and the land defies them because they're along the coast. And so frequently what they end up is sort of a hybrid of small scale farming and then functioning as literal middlemen. They insert themselves in the coastal trade. And so palm oil in particular in Liberia, that they become the middlemen moving African interior goods into, the harbors and coasts, as they expand along the coast before they go into the interior. And so that's how they function, as sort of the literal middlemen along for this coastal trade, which obviously causes more strife and conflict with Africans who were previously held this position.
Yeah. There is, and I don't want to. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I want to get at the last kind of points I'm making. I'm trying to figure out how to best frame this, because I want to. One of the I don't know if ironic is the right term. I don't know. One of the most bizarre, I guess, consequences of all of this is that the Americo-Liberians, who a lot of them, I guess, are becoming the agents, I guess, of American or Western civilization or whatever. And you talk a bit about people, both Africans, Native Africans, and Jehudi Ashman. I think he's a white American. At any rate, people in America and in Africa, people who start referring to Americo-Liberians, once again, African American just to be totally clear, we're talking about African American colonists in Africa who become quote unquote white. Which really kind of puts, I think, the nail in the coffin that race is a social construct, if anything would.
It's the greatest example. I'm biased, but it's the greatest example of it.
And with that said, I also want to make sure I quote you. I really liked this passage from your book, and I think it kind of gets at the heart of the arguments you're making. Quote, "This may be an apt summation of colonial Liberia. A series of small things that added up to great ones. The military coat, a silk battle flag, the ability to write back to the United States about your manly stand against savagery. All of these elements were designed to elevate the settlers into the roles of masculine tamers of the African wilderness, much as the European descendants of white colonizationists believed their forefathers tamed the American wilderness. The possibilities for martial glory were one of the first lessons for male settlers," unquote, in Liberia, that is. I guess, would you like to kind of unpack some of all of this a little bit? What do you mean by that quote? And in addition, I guess I'd like to ask you, what does this just mean? I don't know if you termed it American society, Western society. What is there just something inherently just bad and violent about it that makes us go out and want to get everything? And
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I don't know how many of your readers are poor graduate students, but so let this book began when I messed up.
Okay. Yeah, no, there's definitely some poor graduate students.
Yeah. So dear poor graduate student, that mistake may end up being a book. And so you mentioned Jehudi Ashman. Jehudi Ashman's one of the white agents appointed to oversee the colony. And he arrives very early. So I mentioned that the Monrovia is basically established to the threat of violence. And so the indigenous African peoples around this nascent settlement of Monrovia are not thrilled with it. They join together in an alliance that the Colonization Society actually said was impossible. The Africans were so disjointed it would never happen. And so Ashman arrives in Monrovia. He takes over from a black settler. So again, a black settler had been in charge. Judy Ashman arrives. He's the white agent. He's got the appointment. So he takes over the defense of Monrovia. This Pan-African Confederacy of neighboring nations is going to descend upon this very proto-settlement, right? Nascent settlement. And so when I was drifting in graduate school into this topic, I was really interested in like conservative anti-slavery thought. Where I started, because I was sort of interested. I had known about abolitionism, but this idea that you could be opposed to slavery but also equal rights and everything was. So I was exploring that, and so colonization figured very prominently into this. And so I was, as part of this early research, I said, "Oh, Ashman, colonizationist." He wrote an account of his time in Monrovia. And so I pulled Judy Ashman's, his life and about this attack. And so in Ashman's retelling of this pamphlet that he wrote after he returned to the States, he said, so he arrives on the scene. The settlers are digging in, they're fortifying. It's the tension is high. They're receiving a messenger from this African Confederacy that's basically saying, "Leave. We don't want you here." And Ashman says, tell the leaders, they will soon know what it means to fight white men. And I was like, oh my God, who are these other whites that are here? And who? So it's like I'm looking for, like, did he come with the Navy, with the Army? Are there other colonizationists? And I'm spending days of my time. And now here's my mistake. Microfilm, hadn't been quite familiar with it. Ashman had a nice little, now it's not totally my fault, but the microfilm had a big old crack in it, and Ashman had put a little asterisk after that Whiteman statement. And the crack obscured the asterisk, and I hadn't zoomed all the way out. So I didn't see the footnote. And so I was like, what the hell is Judy Ashman talking about? And so I went back to the source. So there's your good for your graduate students. It's okay to make a mistake. Go back to the sources. Okay. And this time, awesome. I zoomed out. I got the whole page, and it's like, oh, here's a footnote. And he said, for his audience, he's writing to 19th century Americans. He says, white men is a term on the coast for anybody who's civilized.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, the white men are the settlers, the African American settlers, and that's where the book began.
Opens a can of worms, yeah.
and so for these West, right. So to go to your point about race as a social social structure, construction, the indigenous Africans, when these settlers get off the boat, they're Virginians, they're Marylanders, they're New Yorkers. They speak English, they're Christian, they wear top hats and frock coats, right. And so for these West Africans, they look at the behaviors of these settlers and they identify them with the Euro-Anglo-American traders who've been going down the west coast of Africa for centuries now, and they just call them whites. Their identity of themselves is black, and so they just call these newcomers whites. And for these settlers, who the whole reason they're on this shit, the whole reason they're in this new settlement, the whole reason they're in this foreign land is because their blackness was problematic in the United States. Boy, they noticed that.
Yeah.
And so did the colonizationists. And so it becomes this sort of odd thing that the whiteness of the settlers in this time, in this place, becomes a real sort of point of celebration. They actually, the colonizationists use this to sell the colony. They say, because white is good, they're a white supremacist Pan-African organization. And so they say the indigenous Africans are so in awe of the settlers, they call them white. And so that's one of the central paradoxes of this movement that I get at, is that the I call them the prophets of unending, racial violence, that the whole idea is to create a white United States because free people of color can't exist here. These very same people are very aware that race actually can change and evolve and shape. And a few of them, one of the few whites that I really focus on in the book, Moses Shepherd, he's the merchant who wrote about prunes. Shepard, he goes all in. He writes about how I like this, I like this African. He calls it a construction. That was my aha moment when you're in a graduate seminar and you think you're so good. It's like, oh, I'm so smart. I know race is a social construction. I'm a brilliant pebble. And then you read, somebody using that word. I love that. I like the construction, and he's writing it in 1830. And you go, okay, maybe maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm 200 years after the fact. And so that's that whiteness gets it gets tangled in with the ideas of civilization and the elevation of these people, and then the propaganda of it. And I try to take seriously the sort of African understandings of this, but it creates a sort of intriguing and problematic. And since you read the book, I'll ask you your thoughts. So it raises all sorts of interesting questions for this Black Atlantic model, right? Because this, in many ways, Liberia is the sort of definition of what the Black Atlantic is, and yet within it, blackness and whiteness are really contested.
Yeah. Well, golly, now you're really putting me on the spot. A couple of things, I guess, that I would like to mention, just that got me thinking about your book. Yeah, I certainly had me think, I think of one big part of the Atlantic world, I guess, is just like this big melting pot where we're all becoming just modern people, and it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I don't, it's historically very violent and everything. And I mean, it made me realize the complexity of the Atlantic world, that there are, it's not as, to use bad language, it's not as black and white as, just, the Atlantic world was. I don't know. I don't even know where I'm getting with that. The other thing I mentioned, because I specifically was getting at, is there something just wrong with the American society or Western culture?
The violence.
I was struck with how similar with the violence. And one reason I started my podcast is I wanted to get to a question or answer a question for myself by researching this topic of why Portugal and Spain. And I kind of got the long-term answer I kind of got is a little bit about the abuse, and they were talking about a part of the world that was conquered by Rome, conquered by Islam, reconquered by Christianity, and just, the kind of people who are just not necessarily great people. But why I bring that up is I was struck by the amount of people who were Afro-Spanish, I don't know what the term is, Muslims in Spain and Jews in Spain who would participate in this conquistador lifestyle, I guess. And
lifestyle.
and we're talking about 400 or 500 years difference. And that's the same kind of mechanism I noticed is being used, is conquest to achieve greater social power, I guess, in your society. Yeah. Anyway, I noticed that. I
think it's a great parallel, because it raises is violence. Maybe it's not inherently American. Perhaps it's just inherently
right.
Atlantic.
And I don't even want to say, and I do not at all want to, because if you're going to ask me, I guess philosophically, why are people so bad? Like the really bad thing that people do, and it's not, this is kind of just what we do, is the city. The city in particular is bad. And I live in Denver, but it's designed to extract resources from, you know what I mean? It's just, the Spaniards were bad. The Aztecs were also very bad. I don't want to make that point that just, white people or Christianity or something like that is inherently worse. But anyway, I did notice that.
Yeah, and it strikes that. So one of that whiteness and violence are integrated here. But the quote you read, in many ways, it was what inspired me. One of the settlers, Joshua Stewart, He's one of the ones that he ends up freed and in Africa, but he has to leave his family behind. And so he arrives in Africa. He does have some literacy, which already, that's a marketable skill in a colony of formerly enslaved. And so he writes back to his former enslaver to basically just pass along a message to his mother, who's still enslaved. And he, it's sort of a, would you please, my love to, your servants. He uses that language, but he signs it sincerely, Joshua Stewart, and then it's sergeant of the militia. And then under that, he notes, I have 45 men under my command.
Right.
And so it's this sort of subtle, like, right. What a facet, like the first thing you go back to your former enslaver, the person still enslaving your family, and you assert masculine violence that, I'm a sergeant of the military and I have men under my command.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's right. And so Liberia is an expansionist state built through violence. And there's a reason why the modern nation, there's a coup in 1980 and it devolves into civil war. It is a settler society built upon expansion and violence, which is whitening in many ways. So it's no surprise that Jehudi Ashman, when he tells the African leaders, you're gonna fight white men, even though he's the only. If he was in the United States, he'd be the only one that they would identify as white.
Right.
But that those things are so uplift sort of racial constructions and the evolution and progression of race and whiteness. There's something there to it that's remarkably complex.
Yeah. Wow. No. Well, anyway, okay, folks, I think there's an awful lot more we could talk about. Dr. Murray's book is fascinating, and this conversation has been fascinating. Thank you very much. But
my pleasure.
I think we are about out of time. So, folks, if you want to learn more, once again, the author is Dr. Robert Murray. The book is Atlantic Passages, Race, Mobility, and Liberian Colonization. I've left links in the show notes so you can easily find and purchase the book. Anyway, thanks for listening, and until next time, folks, see you later. All right.
Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand. Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. Shit. What's happening here? You're no longer in control, and we're drinking up your beer. This is now a democratic, egalitarian pirate ship. So enjoy your trip, cause it's a mutiny.